Welcome back to Deep Thoughts, ladies and gentlemen. Hopefully my voice will hold up here. Yours truly has been working my butt off. The Patreon folks know all about it because I make them special videos telling them what's going on. So this episode is stimulated by a comment by one of our listeners on YouTube who said, you know what, man, you haven't made any really thought-provoking episodes in a while. The person's not completely incorrect. One, it definitely means that person and I are very similar because I'm not throwing out anything profound, with my other episodes. You have to understand that with these trying times that we're dealing with, a lot of my strategy is to get sort of some healing thoughts out there to sort out the chaos so people don't feel like they're by themselves or they feel like they're in hopeless algorithms. Again, all these, channels out there for truth, half of them are selling something, the other half are selling themselves, right? And nothing wrong with that. But they're not trying to sell you a solution. They're trying to sell you the panic to come back the next day, whether they consciously realize it or not. So I'm not selling nothing like that. I'm trying to give away free consciousness to relax. So this episode, we're going to delve into something I think is very, very real and could be related back to real world things, okay? But I'm calling it the Infinity Blindspot. It's an upper level idea, I think, which goes like this. What's a blind spot? A blind spot is that area in your eye socket where you can't see. No matter where you're looking, there's places in your peripheral you can't see. You got a blind spot in your car. But we also have consciousness blind spots. Now, obviously with the crazy generations that we have corrupted with gaslighting and what have you, we got blind spots for everything. They can't see anything but maybe their hands in front of their face. To further illustrate this, I want to give you an example of sort of cognitive thinking that will apply to this before we get started. I told you that, there's a lot of research into linear language, phonetic language, meaning using letters to sound out words, creating a base set of symbols that have, sounds to them, vowels and consonants, as opposed to iconic language where everything you want to talk about is a picture. So you want to talk about a cat, you got a picture of a cat. You want to talk about a house, you make a picture of a house. Chinese languages, ancient Arabic languages were all iconic. I think everyone was iconic before they became phonetic. And one of the theories that I think bears thinking about, and I think it's very, very real, is that your phonetic language evolutionary, societal evolution, conquered iconic. The main reason being is that someone who thinks phonetically is able to think linearly in time. They're able to conceive of past, present, and future. Because the iconic language people are always in the now, 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 now. What would be past tense about a picture of a cat? Nothing. Maybe you make a cat small, cat big, cat dead. Maybe. I've never seen anything like that in an iconic language. Now, I think they did obviously evolve into that in the Mandarin writing, but that was thousands of years later. At the inception, we started to figure out ways of writing down what we said so we could remember it later. I mean, what a fascinating thing that would be. You think it was amazing for you to balance on your bicycle and have a little bit of freedom? Imagine being able to write something down for the very first time and come back later and read it. And you wouldn't have to remember everything in your consciousness or have to recall something. You could actually read something you wrote a year ago that you forgot you wrote. That must have been phenomenal development of the human mind. But until you can have a language that's phonetic and linear, you have a blind spot for past and future. Well, you might remember the past, but applying it to theory for the future in the way of battle. Battles were won by having strategic movements to predict movements. Why do you think chess was so important to European communities for centuries? Because it trained you to think ahead of the game, to plan moves ahead, future. So what is the Infinity Blindspot? The concept of infinity is an absolute paradox for the human mind, isn't it? What is infinity? Go ahead, tell me. Oh, well, it's when numbers go forever and concepts go forever. Yeah, I guess you're right. But does that help you for 1 second conceive of every number that exists, both in the positive and the subdivision directions? Numbers can go up infinitely, both in the positive and the negative, but they can also be subdivided infinitely. Now, conceive of all the numbers that exist. Go ahead. I'll wait. You can't. Conceive of the universe being infinite. Go ahead. I'll wait. Conceive of God always having existed and always existing. Go ahead. I'll wait. Can you feel your blind spot yet? Can you feel your blind spot? You understand a concept by principle, but you can't conceive of the concept that you supposedly understand. So how do you deal with that? We go to school, right? We learn things like algebra. We learn formulas. A plus B equals C. The way that we can solve these equations is to start replacing the letters with finite numbers and then go ahead and do the math. Okay, that's how we deal with it. Yes, there's an imaginary letter I, which could be construed as infinity. But at any one point in time, when you want to sample a value in an equation, you cannot solve it with infinity anywhere in the equation, let alone every single variable spinning up to infinity at some different point in the number system. One starts at 5, one starts at a billion, one starts at negative pi. So we have a blind spot as a creature living in what is probably, in many dimensions, an infinite existence. We live in the physical infinite existence, most likely. We live in a spiritually infinite existence as well. We may be created by a central consciousness that is also infinite. Okay. So how is it that we are surrounded by a principle of the universe in virtually every place that we can look, from a fractal to a golden mean? Time itself, the whole concept of time. Where would it start? Where would it end? There's no logic to it starting or ending. It simply is and is. Obviously, time is something that you can conceive of because you're in a finite box, and therefore time has a relevance to you. It is a construct in your mind, nowhere else. What happens when man can't conceive of infinity and then proceeds to live ignoring this blind spot? Boy, there's so many examples, aren't there? You spend money like you have infinite money, but you don't. What happens? You go broke, you go bankrupt, you have problems. Credit cards have financial limits, caps, but you spend it like it's infinite. Societies have been rumored to exhaust the resources in their local region. Not that all those stories are true, but I'm sure it's happened several times. They ate all the animals. They harvested all the food, cut down all the trees, injured the environment itself, and then it died off naturally. We find them several thousand years later after things have grown back, and we kind of puzzled as to what might have happened. What happens when man uses resources on planet Earth? As if we have an infinite supply. We have shortages. Then we have problems, not just in local regions, but globally. What happens when if we were to procreate forever on a little finite sphere? Well, even if you think we're not having any immediate problem with our population today, it will get that way. And it not only gets that way, but it gets that way exponentially. And isn't it funny that we can think about the population increase? I mean, it's insane right now. I mean, it's doubling so quickly now, it's ridiculous. And eventually that curve is going to go almost straight up. You get 10 billion, then suddenly you have 20, then suddenly you have 40, suddenly you have 80. You get where I'm going. Now, we know there's a lot of reasons why we would have mechanical problems living on Earth with that many people, mostly the coveting of technology that could facilitate that many people on Earth. But within 200 years of that growth rate, humanity will exhaust the planet itself. Now, influenza would probably mutate and kill off us naturally, because that's what influenza does. Influenza mutates when it comes in close proximity with one of its variants. It goes lethal until that proximity, thus collision, decreases, meaning fewer people are banging into each other. And so that's why it kills off birds on a natural basis. They overpopulate. They don't have any brains. Okay. So how does it help out if you can conceive of the fact that you cannot conceive of infinity? You acknowledge your blind spot. Well, imagine humans in general like to say things like, I'm a great multitasker. One of my partners in my video game company brought a book to work. He brought two interesting books to work that he shared at our weekly meetings. One was a book about sugar and how it is absolutely the devil, because it absolutely is not supposed to be in the human body in any purified sense, thus causing inflammation, which leads to all kinds of health issues, period. But the second book he brought was a book about multitasking. And the book basically said human beings are unable to multitask with their consciousness. Sure, the autonomic system is a phenomenon. It's doing all kinds of things second to second. Now, there are loose exceptions to this rule, but those loose exceptions, of which I'll give an example, are not really helpful when we're talking about the infinite problems that we're dealing with and the problems that are caused by not thinking in infinite manners. Now, my buddy's a drummer. He says, he's drumming in front of 25,000 people wondering if he left the iron on at home. He can do that. If you're a programmer or something, or you've worked in an assembly line of any kind, you can definitely do something mechanical using your muscle memory. I can program and sing a song. It's not unique, okay? So there's little parlor tricks you can pull with yourself, giving yourself the sense that you can actually do two things at once. But on average, 99% of the time, you can't do it. And the parlor tricks you're pulling off, maybe they have use, maybe they don't. But have you ever been in school and had a teacher wise enough to tell you to your face, you cannot conceive of infinity? Now, technically, you can conceive of it. You just can't accomplish it one time inside your mind. At no point can you conceive of the true quantity of infinity. But you might go, dude, what are you talking about? Who gives a shit? Hence all the problems we have with the world. Let's go back to chess for 1 second and let's look at where the world is. And I mean man, woman, and child. What's chess do? It helps you think in advance, seeing moves in advance. Chess masters can think 25 moves in advance. They can also memorize patterns of legendary games. Because there's only so many pieces and so many squares, you are in a classic game virtually every time you play chess, unless you play extremely badly. No one remembers horrible failures. They only remember epic successes. We talk about attention span in the world, right? I think that if you're over 50, you know society when society had an attention span. Because not only did you know your own generation having an attention span, you knew your parents and you knew your grandparents. Perhaps, if you're lucky, your grandparents. If you're a history buff, you'll know that there are folks like Isaac Newton, who invented calculus by the age of 19. Talk about an intense attention span. Any great person in history that's ever done anything that took years to accomplish is a person with a great attention span. We are sitting on the shoulders of everyone with great attention spans. The camera that I'm using, the computer I'm using, the microphone I'm using, the cigar I'm smoking, all required incredible attention spans to invent both the original concepts and the tiny components to make, but also the unit that we're using right now. Now, what if you wanted to do some equations that involve infinite concepts, infinite properties in your equation? Well, again, usually what ends up happening is you take a subsample of finite numbers, which you know algorithmically extend to infinity. So you want to do a sine wave. Technically, the algorithm continues going, depending on what your type of sine wave you're measuring. Without resistance, something goes forever, right? So we take subsamples. We apply it to ourselves. We think, if you think that we have a soul, I should say, then we think our souls last forever. And the major concept there, that's very simple even for an atheist, is where do you hide energy in the universe? The only idea that you could possibly apply to a soul to account for its dismissal post flesh and bone existence or instance would be diffusion. Diffusion requires interaction. Diffusion is a property of the mass world, but perhaps not of the spiritual world. I should say mass energy, right? But what if we have this duality? That we have this potentially infinite mass energy universe that we deal with in the conceptual realm in a finite manner because that's all we can conceive of. That's all we can conceive of in this absolute form. But we have to acknowledge that potentially the ecosystem of a soul energy, perhaps just energy that creates life, the streaming consciousness that goes through a succulent cactus that creates this Fibonacci pattern. It is infinite. It is merely that it exhausts the mass energy that creates the plant at some point, perhaps. But if you think about it, every plant that you've ever seen in your life is just an extension of the original plant. Even human beings are an extension of the original proto-human. Whether God made it, an alien made it, God had aliens make it, or we just evolved out of goo. We are the chain effect of having not completely died out to extinction. Same with all the plants. People who are vegetarians or vegans like to think that eating plants is actually a humane thing to do, because as long as the life force has a relative similarity in its geometry, eyeballs, nose, ears, legs, arms, whatever, hooves, they feel like that is something they can relate to. They see a cute little pig playing in the dirt, and James Wood says, man, I'm not eating bacon anymore. But because James Wood doesn't look at a carrot as a living being, he can eat the shit out of that thing. Plus, you do the math. You're like, well, the carrot just dies in the soil if I don't eat it, so it's trying to bear fruit to me. Well, what happens to a pig if you let it keep going? It just lives a longer life than the carrot, but is simply the same thing. Mass energy being controlled by an ecosystem of life. Can't talk to the carrot yet, right? We don't have a universal translator for carrot talk. So it's not alive for now. So for now, eat that and feel moral about yourself. There's yet to be a definitive science around infinity. To compartmentalize what we would call in computer languages as an instance of infinity. What happens in computer code that you may or may not know is we write a piece of code. And let's just say you're playing a video game, and the video game has a missile. It fires out of all kinds of different towers, rockets, characters, what have you. The missile has a behavior. Maybe it's a tracking missile. Maybe it's just an arcing missile. Maybe it flies in a straight line. Whatever the programmer has decided it can do, they only program the missile algorithm once. If they need multiple behaviors, they create child classes that give it heat-sinking capabilities, arching, artillery capabilities, etc. But those pieces of code are only written once for each one of the different types of species. But when you played a video game, even a stand-up arcade game when you were a kid, you could hit the fire button, and at least after about 1980, you could send out at least more than one missile. Pow, 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 right? Well, that code is technically extendable to infinity, or as much memory as the actual unit has in it. Stand-up arcade machine, PlayStation, home console, telephone, tablet. Well, we apparently have a tremendous amount of energy and mass in this particular universe that we're in, so we're not really limited by anything, right? We can procreate as much as our bodies can procreate. It just continues going. If we don't mow our lawns, and we don't live in the society stomping out the grass and cutting down trees and moving stuff around, well, the whole place will get covered up by vegetation if the ecosystem allows, right? If you think we're in a big universe and we're on a ball flying through the universe, well, then you'll buy any one of the concepts submitted to you by goofy scientists that, eventually the world will collide with some other place, get sucked into a star, get blown apart, hit by another asteroid, whatever. It itself will recycle. Now, technically speaking, we do deal with instances of infinity, and we have since we were born. You want to talk about a star, you talk about one star, even though there might be infinite ones out there, whatever those things are. Any one object that you talk about, like an apple, well, there'll probably be, as long as the Earth stays around, infinite apples. They'll just keep going. You talk about it one at a time, 2 at a time, 10 at a time. You have instances in your mind that help you deal with infinity. A lot of people have problems meditating. I'm probably one of them. And they'll say, clear your mind of everything. I think it's an exceptional ability to have a complex mind and clear it at all. Because as soon as you clear out what you were thinking about, another thing jumps in its spot, saying, it's my turn to be in the thought chamber of this particular being. But now imagine that one of the ways that you could clear your mind is to simply put in your mind a paradox, perhaps infinity. Sit and concentrate on any one concept of infinity. Could be, think about numbers being infinite. Think about space being infinite. You don't even have to agree with anyone else about what you think space is. Just think about it being infinite. Think about time being infinite. Your brain, of which cannot truly conceive of the true spectrum and totality of infinity, will clear out by design. There's probably several of us out there that have thought for a little bit about what it might be to pass away, to die, and just being your body. And your soul joins this sort of infinite light that is often attributed to a heaven, at least an afterlife. And what's funny about it is the more religious constructs have been introduced into the human mind as a temporary mechanism to deal with infinity, you'll have people that couldn't possibly conceive of infinity be very, very satiated with the notion of a heaven. And again, one of the funniest things you can do to anyone who is going to tell you that heaven absolutely exists, as they have read it in a small book called the Bible, or even Quran, doesn't matter. They can't really explain it beyond a small sort of conceptual sentence of infinity. It'll just be great. I just know it'll be great. For me, that's projection. That is what you hope will happen. I do think that they're correct in that, one, it'll be a great place to be, and two, it's immediately infinite. Because again, imagine something existing that has no capability of being destroyed. Maybe that's not true. Maybe a soul could be destroyed. Maybe God can destroy it, or maybe the natural forces in that other realm could destroy it. As it is above, so too is it below kind of theory, right? Man absolutely positively hates anything that man can't understand. And part of it is a self-defeating competition, right? Of course I can understand that. Why wouldn't I understand that? You start sounding like that Martin Short character, right? If we're ever to create a science around being a symbiotic being between flesh and blood and infinity, we're going to have a mechanism to logically discuss this among ourselves, to talk about something that is infinite, just as we do in mathematics. Maybe if you go into certain conceptual classes, time itself. What's fascinating about it, and being involved with several of those different types of projects, think tanks or disciplines, is that we have no problem discussing infinite math. I mean, pi itself will continue going forever as far as I know. There are infinite prime numbers. Time, well, I think the only thing that we have a problem probably dealing with is primarily thinking in previous time, going back forever. Because for us, everything undoes fairly quickly. If you believe official science theories about the human mind and human body and evolution and all that stuff, well, it ends very quickly. 5 billion years, 6 billion years. I mean, the number always changes because they're making it up. But for whatever reason, the future is something that we can completely conceive of until you get into the expanding contracting theory of one Stephen W. Hawking, which most likely will not be the case. Misunderstanding gravity alone will render that theory nothing more than a parlor trick of thought, which has value because it got you to think about it. Star Trek did a fantastic episode. Actually, no, Star Trek. Red Dwarf, the comedy series from the BBC, did a wonderful episode about the crew ending up in a universe that was in a contracting phase. Everyone spoke backwards. One regurgitated their food into perfect form. Bank robbers came up to you muggers came up to you and gave you money. You got in a bar fight, all your bruises came off your face. Brilliant. Got you thinking. Doug Naylor's amazing. The interesting thing is that if you were to draw on a piece of paper, for instance, a human figure, which is obviously, in one way, a ever-recycling supply of mass energy that makes up your body, but isn't truly who you are. It gives your soul sort of an instance container for the life of that being. It's a beautiful journey. And one of the most beautiful things about the universe that I've said several times is this is the most incredible random machine that could ever be created. I mean, the variables are phenomenal. How each day can be completely different. How each time you come back to this planet and are reborn, my gosh, everything changes. Even if you went back in time in some fantasy to relive your childhood, you would relive it different as long as you brought back the knowledge from the future. You wouldn't do the exact same thing, and even if you tried, you'd probably be a little better at it and thus change your odds. Might end up in a better reality, and you might end up in a worse reality. You don't know. And then there's some of us that feel like we've utterly exhausted the spectrum of what society allows to happen in the universe. And so then the tactic is to get into the fabric of society and advance it and expand it such that you're not sitting around being a boring person, being bored. You're investing in your own reality, expanding it, reaching out into what you know you can do, instead of making excuses and waiting for someone else to create the next widget that you can play with. You're now the widget maker, and that can be very fun. But you draw this figure of man, and you also want to overlay on top of it its energy source, its intelligence source, its a true identity, which is this other realm of infinity. One is going to be born in one way or another, exist, and then perish, because that is the actual ecosystem of the mass energy universe. But you're imposing on it a soul that will definitely bring to that construct a personality, instincts. Probably, if we don't poison our bodies and kill our third eye with fluoride and that kind of thing, it allows you to draw on the database of the entire universe to use as your Swiss Army knife for anything you're trying to accomplish in this realm. But because we do not think of ourselves as infinite beings, if you listen to all of the secular education that we are given, then you live a life of over-panic and over-stress. You fear death. You fear it like the plague. But the second you can get existential for a moment and simply acknowledge what you have seen and felt your entire life. An old soul, a child with an old soul, that's a great example. If you're ever at someone's deathbed when they pass away, you will definitely know that their soul left, and what you're looking at is their vessel. Big difference. For those that have gone to the other side in some near-death experience, but they've returned, what's interesting is it doesn't matter their education level, their sex, their gender, their culture, their origin in the world, they will all tell you the same thing. The afterlife exists, and I no longer fear death. Primarily because where they went was wonderful. They're no longer afraid, but it doesn't mean they come here and they sit on their hands. They engage. Because one of the things they tend to say is that life is precious and that what we are experiencing is infinitely amazing. Because they know that that instance is never coming back again. Even if it were to expand and contract and all that jazz, Your soul's not in that realm. So even if you lived your life again in some contracting universe theory, which is again bunk, you would have grown from the first time you expanded, and then contracting would have to be different. But the theory is that it's all predetermined and you're just a bag of chemicals. Untrue. But let me ask you this. Is it important that man ever truly conceives of infinity? Man being this instance in this universe. Well, as I illustrated at the beginning of the episode, yes, there are some concepts that, again, we don't have to necessarily understand complete infinity or conceive of it, but we can look at the algorithmic growth patterns of certain behaviors of man, of which are extremely toxic to the supply and demand that this realm has at its fingertips. If man had the ability to instance the world like a missile, then man would not have to worry about resources or population. Man could just make another world that's empty and put all the new people on there. Keep each planet at its own limitation. So let's go back to the soul body. If I'm saying that mass energy in this realm is merely just the clay to express an emotion of an artist, it is crafted into potentially David in one realm, Cleopatra's bust, or Nefertiti's bust, or Caesar's head, or whatever, a car. That is an instance of thought. That's an instance of being to capture that moment in time in the form of art. And that's what we are and our bodies. But it took an outside concept to mold that clay into something that meant something. And of course, there's the context of life that gives that any meaning whatsoever. I mean, if an alien had never seen a dog before, never maybe even seen a life with an eyeball, ears, and legs, they were some apparition. They had never taken physical form, and if they did, it was more gelatin-like. They wouldn't recognize the dog, as well as we might look at their art and not realize it's actual art. We might think it's a coral reef. But if we're trying to ask ourselves who we are as beings coexisting with each other, because we all are most likely from the same source, if we do have indeed souls, then we're probably from a higher tree of life, where we all communicate out there, seemingly the place that people go each and every single time they have a near-death experience. Now, I recently saw sort of a silly video. This is a bit of a digression for 1 second. There's a video of a couple old men that were trying to tell you some epiphany about escaping reincarnation. The funny thing is, the base principle of what they said has never been quoted by anybody that I've ever seen in a detailed video about going to the afterlife and coming back. I personally have never heard a story of anyone actually claiming to see a tunnel of light. That has always been a Hollywood construct in my world. If anybody has and gave testimony, I have never seen it, but I have seen dozens and dozens of high-profile HD videos, people describing their afterlife, and none of them talk about that. But these two gentlemen basically said that if you get into the tunnel of life, then you go up and you return to Earth, very specifically Earth in human form. But if you turn around and you turn your back on the tunnel of light, what you see behind you is the entire universe. And if you step that direction, then you will cease to be caught in the loop of reincarnation. It's amazing what old men will think up sometimes. Having not experienced it themselves in any way, shape, or form, neither men who echoed the same story had ever died and been brought back to life. Beware of the snake oil salesman. So the question remains, if man constantly recycles, and probably, if I would imagine, of choice, back to planet Earth, and the soul itself is infinite, how could it be that man would be born ignorant at any one point in time? Is it the DNA vessel that we're in? Well, say you have a family that has always been fairly lucky to have money, education, what have you. I have two sides of my family, like everyone. And on each side of the family, we've got geniuses, doctors, scientists who were scientists for a living. But in each realm of the family, we have seemingly people that never gained much intelligence. Sweet human beings, wonderful human beings. But they cap themselves very quickly. And it would almost seem that if the soul itself were recycling and gaining any lesson from being alive, that it really is up to the instance of your body that would limit you from penetrating previous knowledge into this world. There would be no excuse why the soul itself couldn't use its intelligence to metabolize up a denser neural net to handle higher thoughts. Perhaps it's the luck of the draw. Perhaps it has to do with your childhood, or that you have brothers or sisters that waste your time, or in the case of like the Jacksons, you become masters of music and performance. It begs the question that perhaps there are algorithms that the soul grows fond of. And I'll give you an example, like an engineer like Steve Wozniak, who just seemed to gravitate to electrical engineering. Made the first Apple computer, made the first smart basic. Guy was a genius, still is a genius. Phenomenal. Something got him to gravitate to that at a very young age. And hence we have a whole computer company that's amazing. At least was amazing. Infinity begs questions. If infinity applies to the existence of a soul, then it levels the playing field, because the common denominator of all souls is that all souls would be infinite in age. There wouldn't be an old soul and a young soul. Are these things created? Are they like the cellular mitosis of another soul? Our souls peel off a little bit of our soul to create another person at some other point. Are we all connected on the outside like branches on a tree? The same branches, fractal branches that are in the lung, are the same fractal branches you'll find in a forest if you lay down on the forest bed and look up. Is it possible for one soul to have an instance, one branch of perhaps the tree of life, go through a much more intense circumstance and thus gain more algorithmic knowledge, like some crazy neural net? The same principles we use in perhaps artificial intelligence at an infinitely complex level. But one side of the tree is living a much more simple life. Not necessarily ignorant, but just lacking the experience to metabolize up that type of human being. Without acknowledging the blind spot of infinity, these concepts that you may understand 100% as I explain them to you, you may even find them boring. It's because you probably have, and always have had, or at least have had for a very long time, a fairly intense grasp on the implications of infinity in your existence as a being. How many times have you had in your lifetime the simple question of whether or not you have a soul be the very apex of the conversation itself, and not one molecule of conversation exceeds that basic binary question of yes or no, do you have a soul? People debate, they're having an argument, friendly or not. Yes, no, that's it. And when you're done with the conversation, there's either a yes or no on the table on your behalf, and you leave the conversation. But not one second thought about what does it mean to have a soul, and does it have a lifespan? Is it infinite? What are the implications of something existing forever with any modicum of intelligence attached to its pure definition? They always say ashes to ashes and dust to dust, which is the beautiful saying that implicates man as a very finite being. But let's just say you pick Nikola Tesla's body. His ashes, which would eventually be the result of his body decaying in the grave, if harvested up and somehow mixed with something else to instantiate another instance of human being, is that dust of his body, of his bones, of his flesh, is it in itself intelligent? Probably not. It's just mass energy, man. So where does the intelligence come from? We also, and I'm guilty as anybody else, think about this universe in the mass energy realm of our flesh and blood, and things we can't see, frequencies of energy, lightning bolts, that sort of thing, and then this soul realm. But to introduce a third principle to the universe is usually not done very often, and it's so abstract to the mind that we can't truly put together an algorithm to conceive of it. But what if the third component was one that we often will refer to as love, hate, ambivalence, fear. An emotional melody that brings it all together, that controls the very spectrum of left and right, top and bottom, maximum and minimum, macro and micro. It completes the symphony of all things. To put it in another analogy, think of an orchestra made of human beings that grab inventions called instruments. They blow wind through the instrument in most cases, or pluck it or pound it. But it is the music that's on top of the entire orchestra that actually provides the experience to an audience, a third component. They tell you have 5 senses, and those 5 senses are orchestrated to create all kinds of experiences, both in your life and around your life, to provide entertainment, to provide context for a living. If you haven't had a hug for a month and someone gives you a really good one, oh man, that's just the juiciest fruit you could possibly consume. When you start to get into this level of conversation, something will occur to you, usually at some point in your adult life, which is, what is technically alive and what is not alive? A simple answer, based on our conversations we've had over the last 6 years, would be something that is a symbiotic relationship between some life force and the mass energy model that is our universe as we know it, or attempt to know it. Now, I'm surrounded by a lot of mechanical devices. I have that table and chairs over there right in front of me, about 15 feet away. Are one of those chairs alive? I mean, everything's sort of a liquid in this universe, isn't it? I'm sure there's less atoms at the top of the chair than there at the bottom of the chair based on the day it was manufactured. So it is a fluent flux. It's outside. It's oxidizing and rusting. But it doesn't grow. There's no sign of life in it. But all the plants and trees in the background, you guys have seen this bush over my right shoulder go from lush in 2015 in season 1 to probably by season 3 being really tiny, and then back up being lush again as I figured out what was going wrong. The grass grows and the grass dies, and it comes back. It's alive. It has an ecosystem. Scientists will explain it through nutrients and water going through its bowels. It truly might account for all the Fibonacci patterns we see in all things. There's a lot of you who've studied the golden mean, and you understand that the golden mean seems to surround all things that we classify as life, from the human body all the way down to a shell, just a chemical calcium on the outside of some fish or some crustacean. I always think it's interesting when Native Americans talk about the world as being a living mother. Very, very interesting. It does exude characteristics of life, and that we have volcanoes and earthquakes and all kinds of structural rock formations moving around a little bit, expanding Earth especially. You could think of it as completely mechanical, for sure. But for something to exist in any realm of thought, there has to be a substrate that provides the highway of its existence. In the mass energy realm, there's most scientists that go down to subatomic particles like quarks, and that for them is the smallest thing. The most brilliant scientists to ever exist on planet Earth believed in ether and explained everything and invented everything that we use today, as I go on in episodes. That for me is the substrate of this mass energy world. It accounts for all things. Fast-moving matter, slow-moving matter. It's everything. But now in the soul realm, how could a soul just exist in a room by itself? And then you've got your soul existing in the realm by itself. How is it that I know what you're thinking sometimes? I can feel it off of you. I can sense your aura. Scientists might say, well, the body's exuding all kinds of pheromones and electrical signals. If I have visual range of you, I could probably read all the minute muscle, body language configurations, and thus sort of infer from more life as I live longer and longer and have seen that pattern on a human being mean happiness, that pattern meaning something's got you sad or depressed. It's probably a factor of that, but it's probably all the above. But if souls exist, then souls need some sort of substrate, some sort of water. It brings it all together. Water just being an analogy. I made an episode a long time ago. I was talking about us all being the same soul. That we're in multiple time frames at the same exact time, and that reason why I feel bad if I were to ever deceive you, hurt you, or injure you in any way, shape, or form is because technically I'm actually doing that to myself. You've heard your mother, your grandmother, grandfather, whatever, or mother, father, whatever. They'll tell you that, to hurt someone else takes you down 2 steps. I always believed in that because that's sort of how I felt. That's why I never try to do that to anybody in the entire world. And I think the inverse is also true. If you can help one person in this world in your lifetime achieve something wonderful that they desired, to no detriment of another human being, you will feel utterly amazing. Being an educator is one of those professions that does that. But there's all kinds of people. Save someone from a burning building as a fireman. Stop 2 acts of violence between 2 people. Policeman. Be a doctor, a nurse. Entertain someone with something that you created. Tell a good joke. Paint a cool painting. Do something. Improve the world. And believe me, you could balance my checkbook and that'd be the same thing, I recently watched a show, and if you've seen it, I won't even tell you the name of it because I don't want to ruin it for you. There's a show out there. It's got multiple shows that comprise its first season. But they said something sort of, I guess you would say, something we should all understand already. But sometimes you just need it to be spoken to understand it. And it illustrates the spectrum of infinity on one level. Sort of the snake eating its tail in one sense. And this character says to another character, he goes, there's a commonality between being extremely broke and extremely rich. And that is that both people are equally unhappy. But the difference is that when you're completely broke, you tend to think that the reason why you're not enjoying your life is because you don't have something. And therefore, you can deflect away from yourself all of your ailments in the world. You can blame the fact that you don't have money, that you can't do the thing that you want to do. And a lot of us, probably you included, would definitely make good use out of any type of windfall of cash that we might run into, because we can conceive of things and do things interesting. And we'll make mistakes, of course. We might actually run into some moments where we're not quite sure if we know what the hell we're doing. But that's the journey, and that's the fun of it all. But he said, what the biggest problem with being rich is? He says, if you get rich and you don't enrich your soul and bring that thing into this universe, okay, you have no one else to blame but yourself. Because you can afford everything. And if you're bored as a rich person, there's no one you can blame. It's your fault that you're bored. It's your fault you don't like your own life. Which is why creativity is, I think, a constant fabric of this universe. I'm not sure which realm it exists in, probably the soul realm. But if you're a creative person that's stifled by a lack of funding, and hopefully you have more than one avenue, or one avenue that is so expansive, like maybe filmmaking or something, where there's all kinds of things you can do with that cash, and you don't have to do all the work yourself. You just have to have concepts. Maybe you're just a logistical person that wants to move it through the pipeline. You take someone else's idea, get a director to put it together, all the casting and all that stuff done by someone else, but you just want to be the person that finances it to get it made. You yourself want to be surprised by your own creation in this premiering of the movie itself. Nothing wrong with any one of those levels of contribution. But it all comes back, in my opinion, when you start thinking about who we are as beings, to this infinite cycle of existence. And you can truly step off at a atheist realm and look at it as the infinite cycle of man. That's fine. You'll find plenty of wisdom in that analysis by itself. But if you're of a spiritual sense, it doesn't matter what organized religion you may be subscribed to, when you start looking at an infinite sense, that your soul is going to be making several journeys. Again, God built the amusement park It's no sin to ride the roller coaster twice, trust me. You may not have to. You might choose to. You might be doing this, having done this infinite times, like the Q continuum in Star Trek, which I think is probably one of the most definitive moments in cinematic storytelling time of all man's known tales of any concept, where infinity was embraced to be understood, at least at an exponential rate that man had ever achieved prior to that moment. When Q shows up in Star Trek, for instance, the main Q, I think we go through little microcosms of anxiety thinking about who he really is, especially the more he laments about how infinite he is, about how infinite the continuum itself is and how it's always been and will always be. It puts that God concept straight in our face and says, you got to deal with it. When the Q shows up in Voyager and wants to die, wants to be unqueued because he's tired of infinity, that takes it to the next 201 class of thinking about any life force that is conscious of their infinity and unable to instance into a body that is reset from infinite knowledge, which is the gift that we get as human beings, in my opinion. Our survival is dependent on our souls being able to instance a brand new body that, for the most part, in its conscious state, is unaware of everything that's ever happened to us in the past, at least until we gain an upper intellect to perhaps query what we were previous. Now, the only place that I know that is engaged in going backwards, besides individuals hiring people to hypnotize them, what have you, is the Church of Scientology, which took reincarnation and turned it into original sin. You'll never hear a story of a Scientology member ever being a good person in the past. It's always you were an infinitely corrupt, sinful being in your original sin, and thus your need for Scientology auditing is to go back and find out how horrible of a person you were so that you can understand why your current life sucks so bad. It's extremely clever. It's almost like taking Christianity and turning it into an infinite Mobius strip and then charging $380 an hour to be regressed to find out what a naughty person you were. It takes the concept of infinity and almost puts it into a box and then injects inside of it a dependency so that man has to go to man once again to find salvation away from himself. Same thing goes for Christianity. It's more finite. You're born once, you live once, because that was the intellect of man at the time of its invention, and you seek from pedophiles salvation to God. Interesting. Doesn't mean the core story might not have a lot of truth to it, but what it turned into was that. 100%. Well, let me give you a stupid analogy for 1 second so we can understand this just a little bit better. If you were going to be a professional baseball player and you walk out onto the baseball diamond of any stadium that you love, how much about the rules of football do you give a shit about? And the inverse is true. If you're going to be a professional football player, how much do you care about baseball? You don't. You only care about the game you're playing right now. So the interesting thing about man trying to conceive of infinity and deal with infinity as any part of a solution is that you and I, in the human form, which is a very finite instance in all respects, from what we can conceive of at any one moment in time, what our mind can inject into our consciousness at any one point in time, from being born, living, and dying, thus completing the envelope of a finite existence. We do not necessarily need to deal with the concept of infinity, except when you grow to a point where that becomes muscle memory, becomes incidental knowledge to your mind. Then you're ready to expand. Now, the truth of the matter is, the more that you expand into those infinite concepts, and you want to have engaging conversations like we're having right now, albeit one way, I apologize, you will find it to be a very isolating circumstance to advance any potential concept of truth in the realm of infinity until we build decent schools and decent universities of both the philosophical, the spiritual, and the scientific, and meld it all together as our own little Gödel Escher Bach. We will not have intelligent dialogue at any level. People pay money to see people sit on stage and lament and wax poetic about these theories. They might engage in about 10 minutes of conversation after that session, but then they meld back into the world of the finite thinking, trying to accomplish some temporary goal to satisfy the temporary body, that then will be forgot by the infinite soul. Remember what we say about, living these quick lives. Why does life seem like it's going quicker as you get older? Answer: your brain throws away every piece of repetitive patterning that you do in your life. It doesn't care what you ate for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. It doesn't care that you took a shower today, that you crawled back in your bed today. As glorious as those moments might be, and on any one particular day, because the weather's right, you feel good, life is going well, you don't remember those things. You don't remember driving to work. It throws them all away. So at the end of a 24-hour period, your brain will throw away more and more information and only keep that which was interesting. Well, that means the more that you get crawling into patterns in life, you watch the same television show every single day, you do the same thing every day, it's throwing it all away. Unless you can marry those moments with something that is unique and something that is probably more infinite. And I would say, like trying to solve these problems. I've told you guys a number of times, and it's almost weird because I feel like it doesn't make any sense to people, but by at least 1990, I had started this pilgrimage to create my own unified theory of the universe. It was based on a bunch of bad definitions of gravity and a bunch of faux science at the time. But I spent 15 years writing in journals, having conversations with scientists, and, more it got closer to official scientists, the more it made no sense because they were regurgitating crap. I just couldn't figure it out at the time, right? But it made those 15 years of sitting in a bathroom stall at work, sitting in a shower, sitting in bed, driving my car, every split second was used on some sort of project like that in my life. For those of you who've ever tried to create something and you have questions, you don't go to bed with all the answers, and then you wake up and you got the answer in the shower. Your brain was chewing on that problem while you were asleep. Sometimes just rolling over in bed, you think of the solution. Bam, of course. It's good for you. Is it important that we understand the soul realm as human beings? I don't know. What would we define as this? As yes, it is important that we understand that. Well, I would say, one, not fearing death is probably one of the greatest benefits you could understand. It doesn't mean you should take yourself out or anything if life gets hard. I think we're here for a test. It could be a test with you and humanity. It could be a test between you and yourself, you and your God, if you will. What can you do with this life while you're here? It is definitely precious. Even if it's up there and it's like a roller coaster, you just stand in line and then you get in the car and it goes again. It's still precious. There's a lot of things let's think about it. There's an infinite number of things that have occurred to make sure that you exist. Think about it. Every single human that's ever lived before you that is part of your family chain, every person they've ever interacted with that influenced your relatives to go left instead of right, up instead of down. If any modicum of the universe exists the way that they say, with stars and planets and all this other stuff flying around in galaxies, let's just say that was true. Well, then all those movements out there, especially the more infinite it goes, and there's no big bang. There's no big bang back there. There might be a creation moment, but it'd be more angelical than just some ridiculous theory that everything's going to be condensed down to a singularity that's going to explode and then create a random universe and not a unified universe, right? All that's important. So every time that you're born, it's important. It's based on Important. What is important, right? So important is this needed to happen. Unimportant is it doesn't matter if that happened. Well, because you have a consciousness, because you are a living being with a heart and a soul, you hurt when things bad happen to you, and you feel elation when love occurs to you, whether it be an object or a person looking in the mirror, hopefully. Then you're important. You're an infinite being and probably an infinite universe, at least in the spiritual realm. Who knows if they keep this mass energy realm around forever? Maybe at some point, the souls of the universe, being us, we graduate and we say, you know what? That's just the training wheels version of our existence. For all we know, this is a brand of ice cream. And this isn't a finite realm that we are in mass energy realm. We are infinite, which means it's going to take an infinite number of years to push every soul through this one realm. Because it's finite and that's infinite. Anything finite and infinite compared to each other, one is infinitely small and one is infinitely huge. I think we can safely say that if there's a soul, we are infinitely huge. It's hard to conceive of a vacuum of nothing, isn't it? That somewhere, it's almost like a Confucius question. The tree falls and no one's there doesn't make any sound. If nothing is there, does it really exist at all? Because what would be the purest definition of existence? Something is there. Do we consider the void there? What is, right? What's the definition of is? Again, I said this a long, long time ago, and I repeat it every once in a while. The parlor trick you can do with modern-day mathematics is to imagine the lowercase italic I being the imaginary number often used to express infinity in an equation. What is the one letter in most languages that expresses the plural? It's the curvy little letter S. Infinite is. Infinite plural is I-S. It's just a little parlor trick, but it's a very interesting use of that little word. If God has always been and always will be, then God is an is. If we are a soul that has always existed in one shape or another, then we are an is too. And if the universe itself is infinite and there's stars in all directions, then it is an is as well. Man has a blind spot. And it's at the precipice of the conception of infinity. It's an interesting paradoxical realm of just concept. Primitive man, I'm going to assume, was incapable of conceiving of this paradox. And modern man, although I question how modern we really are these days, but let's just say the peak of mankind, I'm not sure what year that would have been, but it's probably a while back, got to the edge of that concept. Invention requires a different way of thinking, doesn't it? Art that evolves requires a new concept of thinking. New forms of music require new forms of thinking. If we do not have a routine encounter with these paradigms of which we previously would acknowledge or should acknowledge as a blind spot, an area we couldn't conceive of prior, then we start becoming stagnant. We start, in God's eyes, I would imagine, mathematically becoming trivial. Well, Earth hasn't created anything new in a really long time, at least by any major standard. Or maybe God goes, well, we're in that cycle. We're in a more static cycle. I think in the modern day, especially 2021, for those of you who are awake and aware that there's potentially a physical threat to mankind at this point that's trying to be spread into every human being's body, your perception of being alive in this human flesh and being freed from this human flesh by no contribution of your own, it's now something that's surfacing. We're starting to see the more existential realm as if they get their way, then we're going to be ejected way sooner than we would normally be ejected into that infinite realm. Nothing to be afraid of, in my opinion. Imagine convincing yourself through secular desires, the mall nation, as George Carlin put it, fighting to be in prison, fighting to be a captive, fighting to adopt concepts that do nothing more than rot your existence. And then you're freed from that. And you're like, oh my gosh, what was I doing fighting for that? I'll just come back at a different time when things have calmed down a little bit. We'll let the kids run the world for a little while with their woke nation. They'll find out they know nothing about holding together a society. Their imperatives and priorities are completely inverse to actually existing and evolving. As much as they think there's problems, there aren't problems. They've invented problems out of thin air because they wanted to be involved with something that was important. They wanted what they couldn't have, and they wanted it now. That's another big one. I made an episode about reacting. And I think there's a principle of infinity attached to reacting. And it goes something like this. And I think all of you have either experienced it by having the wisdom to do it right, or you fell for the reaction algorithm, as we all have. And then later you found out that if you had just chilled out, things would resolve themselves. We always say time heals all. And for those of you who understand that that's true because you've gone through a crisis that you thought you could never get over, you did. You were hurting really bad at one point due to some reason. And time eroded that concern from you. You understand the positives of infinity. Something's going bad. The economy gets bad. Well, some people think it's the end of the world. The sky's falling. But those who are older go, well, no, we're just one of those cycles right now. And it sucks. And it's probably not our fault. Could be our fault, but it's probably not. Let's go through the cycle. Things don't last forever. People don't accept reality in one state forever. That's the very interesting thing. Hence, the fact that today they have tried for decades and decades and decades to pollute our minds with bad news about situations. The second we stop caring about it, because we've just been abused by those algorithms so much, well, they don't work anymore. We become immune to the drug. Imagine being immune to all negativity because you've been surrounded by it for so long. It's just background noise. You start enjoying life. Reacting quickly is where we get embarrassed. Being patient, not letting necessarily infinity take place, but using the substrate of infinity, which is time, in one sense, it fixes things. We get wiser. We suffer less. Everything's an instance, isn't it? The science of dealing with infinity is to cut it down to instances, which is what we do, but do it consciously as opposed to unconsciously. A formula that has numbers to fit all the letters solves itself very quickly. A formula can have any numbers stuck in it, and it still will work. And that's our lives. We are variables. Our lives are made of seemingly infinite variables. If we lived infinitely, we would deal with infinite variables. But for the sake of our lifespans, it's a very, very long time in most cases. All kinds of things happen to us, and we deal with it. Is it possible to live as an infinite being inside of a human body? To accept the blind spot and potentially see it for the very first time and then see through it, such that infinity becomes a part of your overall identity? I think it's huge. And I think it will remove your concern with the world's issues at any one point in time, your particular life issue. It is easy to become disappointed in a particular instance called a human being. This particular instance, sometimes it seems like people will never, ever learn anything their entire life. I'm pretty sure I got some family members that will die thinking the world's one way, and the second that they are imbued with truth on the other side, they will suddenly realize that everything was almost the inverse of what they thought, and that their life that they just spent was an interesting exercise in being gullible, being duped by other secular beings that did not believe in anything infinite. I don't believe, and I'll close with this, I don't believe that people who engage in acts of evil, define it any way you like, I don't think that they have any concept of infinity whatsoever. And I think it is directly proportional to their engagement in evil acts, that they have no concept of believing in infinity. And the interesting thing is that a lot of these people who engage in complete acts of evil, if asked about their intelligence and their perception of the world, they would rate themselves as high as the rating goes. But their behavior completely negates that answer. Like one doth protest too much, you know? The more that you can conceive of infinity, the more you gravitate to good. Because you know this is not going to go away. Your deeds will not be forgotten. It doesn't mean you'll burn in hell or something forever. An infinite punishment for a finite crime makes no sense to me. But perhaps carrying around a scarlet letter for a little while until you can undo the misfortune that you may have instantiated in someone else is resolved. Like a mathematical equation. If you're at -10, then you need to do 10 good things to bring it to neutral. If you want to walk around with a 10 positive, you're going to have to do 20 things good. It's a crude analogy. But I think that's sort of the rubber band sine wave that evil people will live in. When we think about the test of being alive as beings, for me, what we are now gathering out of the world that is of utmost importance is that which leads to an infinite level of enlightenment, which means understanding of where you are, of what you are. And I think that third potential substrate, which is one of emotion, is the true goal of the two marrying each other, the body and the soul marrying each other, is to produce the byproduct, which is the third substrate, which is emotion. We say God is love and love is God. And I think that's a beautiful, accurate statement. Maybe it's crude, but I think it's accurate. Prince had a song called Positivity off his Love Sexy album. He says, it's more hard to love than it is to hate. It's a very interesting concept, very simple. He probably didn't invent that saying, but I think it's very true. Love is an effort. And I think we find a lot of low-effort human beings, low-vibration human beings that research nothing, know everything, that spew nothing but hatred because it's an easy dopamine hit throughout the day. I really hated that person today, and I feel accurate in doing so, justified in doing so. It's a small dopamine hit for a short attention span, low IQ person. But to invest in the chess game of life, to produce something that might not show its face for years until you're done, equals love. Love for the craft of what you were doing, and hopefully entertaining to the rest of humanity. But think about it. When you touch people's souls in a positive way, whether you wrote a song or you just simply help someone on the street, you're actually affecting their soul, not just their body. The network, which is the tree of life, gets invigorated by your investment, by your sacrifice, by your creativity. Feel your blind spot. Engage it. Try to find like human beings, in my opinion, who will get into these conversations with you and sit for hours, like you're role-playing a great game. Think about it. Take it to the next level. This is just an introductory class of what would be some potential concepts that will be added to your life. If you can envision any concept of an infinite existence, try not to just say, well, yeah, it's just infinite, whatever. I got to pay the bills. Set aside some time. Use all that spare time that you're wasting in those useless patterns to engage yourself. Get a pen and paper and write some of your concepts down. Draw pictures of what you think things might be in an infinite realm. See the ecosystem that you've never seen before through your own eyes. Because, we watch shows like Marvel and all those Marvel movies, and it's all based off of several beings have mutant genes. Stark just had a major IQ, right? But the Hulk was a mutation, right? You have recessive, amazing genes of intelligence. You are the byproduct of every human being you've ever been related to. That obviously were amazing human beings because they survived every single epoch of time prior to your existence. By definition, you are an amazing person. Through and through. If you're being sustained by essential consciousness, then there must be something special about your soul in general. Why would you be created otherwise? And if you think your soul lives in a realm which is pure light, which most of us have, it's an analogy, but most of us believe something like that. Well, then you're flawless in one realm. Only your human body could possibly engage in a rule system and fail, like Adam and Eve eating an apple. Doesn't mean you know everything that the essential creator might know. I honestly wouldn't probably want that job if it was handed to me for free. I like having my little subset of reality. But perhaps we're all tied together. Maybe we are a tiny little molecule in the tree of life, which is that central consciousness. Anyway, let me know what you think. Hopefully that got your mind stimulated. If you haven't been to deepthoughtsradio.com, please go. Everything's up there. Audio, video, social media, all new remastered season 1, a store with some fun shirts up there. And to those on PayPal and Patreon, thank you so much. You guys have been absolutely kind in that realm, and I super duper appreciate it. Take care of yourself and someone else, and I'll see you in the next infinite realm on Deep Thoughts. Over and out.